Hello, most perfidious gentleman of the rouge shirt and the sullied hair.
And good day to you, scabrous worm of undefinable parentage.
I'll take being a dragon.
Worm with an O, not a Y, thank you very much. We are Adventuresome Reviews.
Today, reviewing not one, not two, not three, not four books, but a series.
Which happens to be about 4 books long.
Four. Titled The Bronze Rebellion. Gold Shadow is the first book. Emerald Dream is the second book. Agate Memory is my recollection of the third book. And then Obsidian Fragrance is what the fourth book smells like.
So a great deal of confusing titles that only sort of match the contents of the book.
Quick query! Author's name.
I have absolutely no idea, actually. I've completely forgotten, which is a dramatic oversight on your part, I must say.
You had one job.
I actually had multiple jobs for once.
We'll add it somewhere important later on. Don't worry, it'll be like real small text on the bottom of the screen. You're sure to miss it. And it'll defeat this point of this review entirely.
Yes, indeed.
Anyway, my most austere and penultimate human, what is this series of books about? We're not doing a synopsis because there's 4 books, and we could have just done the synopsis for the first book. That would be pedantic.
Yes, and reading is hard.
Hard.
Most unfortunately, it is your run-of-the-mill rebellion book.
Teenage rebellion book. And oh, while at first glance that would make my garters shiver in shame and fear, this book manages to distinguish itself from the plethora of teenage and revolution books by one fairly significant level. This book is brutal.
Absolutely murder.
The plot for the book is that you have a wealthy kingdom full of your heinous nobility and all your typical shenanigans, and then beneath that you have hive cities where they've enslaved huge swaths of their population and regularly commit genocide on these cities. And you
a lot of these people in these cities, they're called the underground or the ground cities.
The hive cities.
The hive cities?
Root cities.
Root cities, okay. They're called, in the book, they're called the root cities, and they're underground. And you have some people who have never seen the light of day, or most of them probably have not seen the light of day for decades.
They are abused, they are starved, and it's not just 1 or 2 root cities. There are dozens and scores of them just scattered throughout the kingdom. And so it takes a standard rebellion book, and it also helps that your main character they introduce is bred in this awful environment, so you are immediately immersed into the depravity, and it completely merits and justifies the rebellion. Not that rebellion books aren't justified per se, but it really just helps distinguish this book from the rest of the genre.
The book holds no punches throughout the entire series. Even like after the story starts, and many books would have everything start going happy taffy, laffy daffy. This book doesn't. It continues just going downhill, up a little, downhill a little more. It's very conflictory.
Yeah, and it really just makes the book worthwhile reading.
That being said, the fact that it's a rebellion book, ameliorated by its brutal nature, is a kind of a good and bad theme that continues throughout the entire book. It is a bit of, I'm going to say, tortured genius throughout. Parts of the book are just like absolutely fantastic. Other parts of the book are just well nigh terrible.
Mm-hmm.
But at its end, the book was just, or the series, right, was far better than it was bad.
And so the bad elements are the series, and we'll start with the two prevailing ones, because there's some small elements in individual books, but the two elements of the series that formed the major ones throughout the entire series was that the prose could, and very often did, stray into, not like egregiously bad, but weak, and just very... flat isn't even quite the word, but very heavy in the passive she was angry, or very blunt and
telling.
And so it just often sapped strength from scenes, or was uninteresting to read, or whatever. And it was prevalent, and there were scenes where the prose got better or worse.
And there were scenes like that, just like we said, landed really well, and the prose really stepped up to elevate that scene.
And the prose probably does feed into the second element, which was the conflict. This is an action series, but the conflict was not the author's strong suit.
And
it was at its best.
We mean the fight scenes, not...
Yeah, the actual mechanic, the I hit you with my sword and kinds of nonsenses, and woo, martial artism.
The conflict was not only bad, but it was also extremely... I'm not entirely sure that's plausible throughout the entire series.
People with swords taking on guns and grenades.
But no, it's not just like, aha, I have a sword, there's 5 guys over there. No, it's, I have a sword, there's 100 guys over there. No problem. And these are not superhuman, genetically engineered, no, nothing. It's like, random person, 6 months of training, haha, I'm gonna go kill off an entire army by myself.
And so, by that, like, yes, that is very much a thing, but it's also kind of one of the things, like, I know that's not plausible, I don't necessarily care that it's implausible, because it wasn't
painful. It was just, yeah, that totally happened. Let's move along now.
Because it was never... Because it's an interesting point, because, like, look, even when I was reading the book, I was saying, this is in no ways a plausible... This is completely exaggerated, fake fighting mechanics, but it never bothered me. I think it's because the fake mechanics never really came at hard expense of the story, if that makes sense. It wasn't in a moment like a character's in the scene, she's surrounded by 100 goons, and they all fire on her, and it's a huge scene set up to be a cataclysmic end and death, and then the character blocks all the bullets with a parry dagger and goes, "Why?"
Stormtrooper aim was prevalent throughout the story.
Yes. And there were other smaller, goofier scenes where the action were, like in the 4th book, there's this one character, this random stormtrooper comes out of an advantageous scene to monologue, and people he has no interaction with, and it's just... There are scenes like that throughout all 4 books.
Mm-hmm.
Now, those qualms aside, we should tell you why we like the book, and I really liked specific books in the series, and liked the series as a whole.
I'd probably let's deal with book 2 a little later in its own kind of segment, but deal with just kind of some of the So, the thing the book does just absolutely fantastically, like almost one of the best I've seen ever, is characters. The character you're introduced with is
Ebony,
and she is emotionally dead
and simultaneously feral. And I actually really like quasi-feral characters.
They can be thoroughly enjoyable, yes.
Because they're dangerous and there's restraint, and that is the character you journey through the start of the storybook. She comes from a root city. She has spent her entire life oppressed and not tortured, but starving and vying for survival,
and in constant danger of getting dragged off into a corner to be abused and raped and other such things. It's very dark place.
Yes, and so come that you have a character that, like he said, is emotionally dead and feral, and yet
And the very first chapter you introduce her is like, I got sick of dynamite. I'm going to go commit suicide. So that's the state the character is in at the start of the book. And
but careful to know is that, and this, like, you have the abuse and the unemotionality of it, but the feralness is extremely important because it gives the character raw agency. Ebony is forceful. She commands the scenes, or rather, like, the book. Whenever she is present in the story, she has momentum and force and controls the story. She's not a victim despite all the abuse she goes through. And that's why I really, because you have all the abuse, but then you have power and the strength and the danger, the dangerousness she can bring to bear.
And it's not just this personality trait affecting the world, it's other characters around her will be actively, she's walking through a tunnel and this guard comes up and she's like, just stares him down. He actively backs up and says, nope, I'm out. Right? The characters in the world are actively intimidated by her sometimes. Which is just, once again, building into the fact that the book does character exceedingly well.
Not just character as a single character, but character interaction and character growth.
And personality, and just, like, everything.
So eventually, as she does, Ebony, our main character, joins the rebellion. Ooh. Typical nonsense.
Yes, but there's no but here. Before she joins the rebellion, we are introduced to her fellow slaves, right? And we get a glimpse into the fact that Ebony is not entirely emotionally dead, and the fact that she has a rather vibrant, heroic streak in her. And so, back to you.
And so this goes back to the point I was not building towards, but segueing in towards most sneakily and snake-like, because I'm worm, was she joins the rebellion, and there's a lot of great scenes and interactions that come from this. They're at their table, they're stuffing themselves because they have been starved their entire life. Some random person comes in, character you don't know. Ebony sees this character and freaks the hell out. She grabs a table knife and jumps away like she's prepared to stab this other person to death. And the person's reaction is, wow, one of you people actually has value. And I loved that scene. Oh, that scene was great. Kind of ruins to spoil it, but I loved that scene and that interaction.
Yeah. And so, retreating back to the abuse and being embraced into the rebellion is they walk into the rebellion's stronghold. There we go. And they are absolutely floored by the idea of air conditioning. They walk in there and it's freezing to them because they've been living in 80, 90 plus degree weather their entire lives. And then you get to the buffet scene, right? It's like they've been living on gruel, and so it's like the rebellion says, here, actually eat up. They say, a buffet for you. Enjoy yourselves. The slaves, because Ebony and her rescued slaves are all there stuffing their face, and one by one they start upchucking. They upchuck, then they immediately go back to the food because that is how absolutely starved they are. They cannot conceive this much food being on the table.
And that scene does so much for validating their characters.
And just, like, bringing home the abuse. Because, seeing air conditioning as a slightly uncomfortable feature of the world and just completely alien just drives home how...
Mm-hmm. And so, there's a second character, a second primary character for Goldshad on this is the princess of the kingdom. And
cardboard cutout, princess, green dress, pampered, completely oblivious to the world.
Naive,
but
sheltered.
Even farther beyond that, because she has a group of friends with air quotes, right? Palestine. They are basically leveraging her to get into all the secret parties and abusing her and just all the while...
Abuse isn't quite the correct word, just leverage and...
And all throughout this, it's like, where are your friend, yada yada, they're sniping and they're cutting each other, and it's just like all knives out. and she is completely oblivious to this.
Probably willfully oblivious because of how desperate she is to have friends. And her name is Irene. She's the princess. And for the first book, Irene's story is not bad by any means, but it has nowhere near the depth of personality and character and sheer force that Ebony's perspective has. And so whenever it came to one of Irene's chapters for me, I was always a little bit let down because of how much I liked Ebony's chapters, how much I enjoyed her interacting with the story and the world.
And so this is partially caused by the fact that nothing really happens in Irene's story. She gets probably like a third of the book dedicated to her, and it's dedicated to just really exploring where she is at this point in the story, right? And you get to know, because she has an incredibly distant relationship with her parents, right? So her father is, I don't care about you, and will actively get angry at her frequently. Her mother is just downright cold and well-nigh straight up manipulative and almost abusive in a manipulative fashion. Her parents are obviously the king and queen, so they're just not good people, not even to her. She has exactly 3 people she likes. Her cousin, who has abandoned her, right? Who doesn't want anything to deal with it anymore. For good reasons, but we don't know that. We don't figure this out. The captain of the guard, who is her only parental figure, or not parent, her father figure. And then a maid who has been disappeared for about a couple years now, 2 or so, right? And she's absolutely devastated by this fact, and it is practically the only thing she can harp on about throughout the entire story, which is, at once it gets a bit old, but at the same time, it goes a long way to solidifying just how desperate she is for affection, despite being the queen. So she is this naive, indoctrinated, arrogant princess, but underneath this, you have this lost puppy that goes a long way to making her likable.
Mm-hmm. Yes, she is likable despite everything that's going around. It's just her story doesn't have the oomph that Ebony's does, and so it ends up not detracting isn't quite the word, just not being as enjoyable as Ebony's does.
Mm-hmm.
The first book ends, and I'm going to be ambiguous here because I don't want to spoil anything. The first book had a great ending.
Like, absolutely fantastic. Ebony comes up into this meeting of leaders, says, I have an idea. It's a terrible idea. It's a crazy idea, and it just might work.
I just said I didn't want to spoil it.
I wasn't going to tell them what the idea was. And for once, the idea is like, and for once, me as a reader was like, yes, that's a crazy, stupid, insane idea. I totally agree with you. This is totally not going to work. But it might. It's just insane enough to work. So it's like, it's probably like one of my favorite scenes for the first book.
There are so many great scenes spread out throughout the series. Most of them, not most of them, but a lot of them concentrate in the first book, which is why I ended up giving the first book 4.5 stars of a rating despite prose and the weak action. Because there's so much I just adored about it. So much I just absolutely loved and enjoyed about the series. So many scenes and characters.
We can't necessarily get too much into the second book without spoiling the first book.
I have no solution, but I will embrace the answer vacuousness and vagaries.
But we can't, because we can't talk about the third book with any degree of enjoyability.
We can still touch on the core themes, especially like the second book is.
I want them to read the series entirely because of the third book, though.
So, I will move on and embrace this challenge with certitude and courageousness and many other.
I'm going to whimper and complain because we are being cut off at the knees and it is painful. I want to talk about it.
But the series very much does merit just reading for itself, and spoilers would hurt it in a way that, because there are some books, some stories where knowing the ending can actually give a different but still extremely enjoyable experience. Being spoiled coming into advance. We've experienced these stories. This is not one of those stories that you want to be able to experience it for the first time blind. So I am going to be purposefully vague. You're going to have to accept that. The second book focuses more on Irene and her evolution as a character. And stuff happens. She begins to build a romance with someone, and the romance is really well handled. The meat of the romance is in the second book and a little bit in the third book, and it is a really well handled romance. It has believable and compelling speed bumps and conflict in between the two characters, and it involves the evolution of both the two characters in both in of themselves and their evolution as a relationship.
But it's like, what's really important is that the character she starts romancing is perhaps the most broken character in the series.
Severely, emotionally, and not physically, just emotionally damaged. Roiling PTSD among other stuff. And just, it completely validates all the speed bumps their relationship goes through and makes the final culmination of the relationship triumphant because it involves that character surmounting his trauma. And that goes back to how good the relationship and the character dynamics in this story are. It's not just a paper cut, oh, I am broken, damaged male love interest. The character has every right to be damaged, and the readers are forced to experience that damage on the relationship's journey.
You would not fault that character one iota for going on a massive rampage, turning psychotically insane and becoming a supervillain, basically.
And this trauma forces scenes into the relationship, or causes scenes in the relationship that are severely uncomfortable. Severely like, oh, I hate that you did that, while you simultaneously understand why. And that is a good romance. That is a good relationship.
And then like the very start of the romance is you have this damaged character hooking up with Irene, and Irene attracts him because she is not damaged. She is innocent and purity, and in a world of darkness, she is clean, which is an engaging characteristic for their relationship to start. And it's not leaned in very heavily. She's not like the light in his darkness or what have you. It's just a compelling contrast that allows the relationship to get started.
Mm-hmm. And through the course of this book, as is inevitable, so I don't consider this a spoiler, Irene is confronted with the depravity of her kingdom. And this is not an immediate transition, or no, it is an immediate sucker punch, but then it keeps hitting her.
Yeah, it's not.
And it was great. It's not just, oh, my kingdom's so evil, I must turn and help them. Irene is absolutely brutalized repeatedly by the reality.
She spends like 5 days just upchucking as she is constantly introduced to one new horror after the other.
And it is traumatizing, as it has every right to be. It's not just a character stumbling upon evil and deciding to fight it. She is actively horrified. Her entire psyche is rearranged by what she experiences in the opening parts of this book. And again, that elevates this story above most Revolutions books.
So Irene gets a little bit of a stab wound. Do we want to elaborate upon that at all?
No.
Okay. It's a very minor stab wound. Don't worry about it.
And so, for all the good I've just spouted about this book, this book has one major flaw.
Well, I still have yet to dish out a flaw. I have, but go ahead and continue with yours.
Ebony gets completely sidelined.
Ebony, the titular character for book 1, Genius Incarnate, gets forgotten.
On one hand, you understand it, and the flaw of the book is almost entirely at a personal level because you understand it. It is a flaw purely because of how much I adore her character and liked her. And then to have a story that features only 20% of her, and most of that not the emotionally raw, important scenes, like all the awesome scenes you get from her from the first book, is just tragic to me.
Yeah, so if you remember, the first book primarily dealt with it. It spent the entire book saying Irene's going to be a character later on. But Ebony's the present character who is powerful, emotionally traumatized, and what have you, and just really building up, only to spend the next book on the significantly less decent Irene. No insult to Irene, or she's just no Ebony at this point. So that is marginally depressing. But then you start getting into the emotional trauma of Irene realizing her family's depravity, and that smoothed out a lot of the wrinkles and such nots.
The second part of the second book, Emerald Dream, is a little bit weaker because...
Oh, okay, so Emerald Dream. This is one of the titles that kind of makes sense because Irene has these vibrant green eyes, and usually I don't give two hoots about eye color, or it's like, oh, you have weird eye color, whoop-de-doo, right? The book makes fantastic use of this because she is the only one given a very specific eye color, or there might be some others and yada yada yada. And basically every other character has dark eyes, and then Irene comes sweeping in, and she has vibrant green eyes, and they are used consistently throughout the story to great effect, and it suddenly becomes her most defining character trait. And you can suddenly see this crowd of people, and from the middle of them is Irene staring directly at you with these vibrant green eyes that you can see from a mile away. It's a beautiful image. It doesn't happen in the book, right? But that's what I see when I look at Irene. It's just these giant peepers of brilliant viridian. And it's actually fantastic.
The second part of the second book is a little bit weaker because this is after Irene has been confronted with, and this is... The events here are less emotionally taxing and striking and important, and less narratively important. This is more, not necessarily more or less, this is like a really bad way to describe it, but this is kind of like the training / the preparing sequence for
It's a
Irene.
training montage.
But not quite.
It's very much a training montage. That is exactly what it is. It's let's draw plans and train.
That's not a training montage because it happens over a couple hundred pages.
It's a long training.
And there's stuff and events happen. It's just nothing as important as the first half of the book happens, and so it ends up, for me, this book is being more on the weaker end of the series, coming in more around the 3.5 stars. Some really good moments, but not enough Ebony, and moments and a weaker second half. Do you have more you want to talk about for the second book?
I'm going to talk about the flaws, some flaws I have for the book.
Okay, you do so. I will fall asleep.
Goes to show how much he cares about my opinion. So
I don't care about your opinion.
That was kind of the point. Thank you very much.
I disagree.
Being contentious, I see. I have two qualms with the book that we have not mentioned yet that are unfortunately consistent throughout. One, we'll start with the minor one, is that the author has too many characters. It's not a dramatic flaw, it's just you have Ebony, Irene, and then you have maybe like another 20 main characters. And that's maybe exaggerating by 2 or 3 people, right? There are a lot of characters, and while they have places and parts in the story, there's not enough screen time, and diversity suffers sometimes with that.
Ignore that. That's our dog. She wants to come see what we're doing. To cuddle with us and usual shenanigans.
But we should deprive you of her cuteness, so weep. Curse your gods and
despair.
Despair. Yes, but draw the line at complaining to us, because we don't want that.
And don't despair 4 times, because
that just gets dangerously close to moping.
Yes, and entirely unrequired.
And so the other kind of rather substantial qualm I have with a story is not character interactions. You have these scenes with characters, and a lot of them get ridiculously repetitive. Snappy comeback, insult your mother, it's snide comment, insult, knock you on your back. And it's not just between these two characters, no. The entire cast acts this way with each other. And it just gets... can we get along to the interesting, actually new part about this segment of them flipping each other the bird 10 times? And it happens every book, consistently throughout. It gets really boring.
Just another point is that part of the character interruption is you have Ebony, you have her main teacher, and this does involve the few of her scenes in the second book. She has a great relationship with her teacher. Their relationship runs along the lines of go die in the fire, you get hit by a car. Not those exact, but that mentality, but all the same.
It's like, goodbye, take care, flips the bird.
And it's completely unusual mentor-student relationship, and I really enjoyed it.
Yes.
Because at the same time, it's like they don't actually hate each other, they just are really bad at expressing emotions. Both of them, and it makes for some really nice scenes.
Yeah.
We ready for the third book?
Oh, the third book. Ah! This is the entire reason I want you to read this series. It is absolutely, unequivocally awesome.
Third book, again, focuses 95% on Irene and 5% on Ebony, which would be a tragedy, except for Irene is awesome in this book.
It's the culmination of the two past books, and it completely pays off everything the author set up in book 2. It completely
won.
Yeah, it completely redeems book 2 spending too much time on Irene.
And so Irene is in the palace. Her eyes have been opened. She has been trained in all kinds of stuff, and all around her are the sycophants and the nightmares and her friends, and she she comes back-ish to the palace, and she faces them and pretends to be naive. She does not change, and so she's talking with all these people, and she's like, oh, that was so funny, and
she completely replicates her former personality, which is absolutely fantastic, because Ebony couldn't do this to save her life. Ebony couldn't put on an act, couldn't pretend to be herself, practically, right? And Irene comes in here after having her eyes open to hell and basically fools an entire kingdom.
While internally you have her mind, and it's deconstructing and plotting and scheming and building a power base while dismantling her enemies, which are her parents. And she meets these people, she deconstructs them, she plots, she schemes, and it is glorious.
She meets smart, powerful diplomats and queens and kings from other countries, and she's like, hi, I'm this simpering, stupid little princess, and they have no idea. She fools other people.
And they hate her because all they see is the naive, weak-willed, simpering princess, which is exactly what she wants them to see. And and then she sees them for who they are, and then
and she uses it against them. And these are not evil people, right? They are potential allies who she does not want to risk coming out to, because she does not trust anybody.
And then you start getting to the payoffs of this perception conflict. Somebody comes in and goes, I know a little bit about what's going on with you. You're not as foolish as you would let others believe. I am going to manipulate you to my ends, try to control you. And she wipes the floor with him.
He comes in cocky. He leaves practically shitting himself with fear.
And it is fully merited, totally awesome, and just the first of several scenes of this.
She comes into the palace alone, and she starts tearing it down with a maid as an ally.
She had to basically, not strong arm, but she straight up bullies and torments into being her ally. And torments are not the wrong word, but just manipulates and prods and scratches until she figures out who the maid actually is before she lets the maid see who she is. And that's important.
there are people a part of her schemes who don't even realize they are a part of her schemes. Right? This includes her maid and a couple soldiers and her cousin, I think. No, not her cousin's gone at this, missing in action at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just like absolutely fantastic, and
the book is just awesome to experience. It has so many awesome payoffs.
It is the absolute best display of wolf in sheep's clothing I have ever seen.
Made more poignant because the sheep used to be a sheep and was fully believable and understood as the sheep. And awesome book. Another 4.5 stars for me. I don't know which one I prefer between this one and the second one. I think Agate Memory maybe is a little bit better.
You mean the first book?
No, Agate Memory may be just a little bit better. Just
you gave Agate Memory 3.5 stars.
Agate Memory is the third book.
Okay.
Emerald Dream is the second one. Gold Shadow is the first. Or between Gold Shadow and Agate Memory. These are the two best books in the series for different reasons. And I may give Agate Memory a little bit more.
My favorite is the third book.
That's Agate Memory.
Yeah, Agate Memory. It's just okay. So Agate Memory drops so many of the flaws throughout the series.
It has the least action and the most character interaction. And so it emphasizes the author's strengths and minimizes her weaknesses.
And it's like every 2 chapters there is a great scene, or it's like, oh, I can't wait until you learn the truth, oh, you little worm, you. It is just, it's like, and she is met with threats, and it's like, and her enemies are like, oh, I'm so powerful, I'm so scary, I am Pimp Controller, and it's like, you have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with.
And going back to the character, you have no idea who you're dealing with. That is not the author telling you that. That is the reader telling the characters that. Irene's evolution from being the sheep to being this wolf, this predator.
She is a predator, right?
Is fully realized, believable, and awesome throughout these 3 books.
This third book.
Well, no, the journey begins in the first book.
Yeah. There's a couple more scenes, but we aren't going to spoil them. But just know that they are awesome entirely. So
I have almost no qualms in this book, besides just a small one that, again, it features very little Ebony, which I just adore Ebony. It's one of the few things she was one of the few things I would actually consider myself a fanboy of, just because. And Irene got a little bit of fanboy status for me in this book, but
a little bit. You spent more time just gushing over the third book. Irene is very much a heroic figure.
Irene is awesome, but I wouldn't have given myself fanboy status. Because fanboy status is a little bit of worship without merit, or blind worship in the face of merit.
All right, so moving on to the 4th book, and
the series again gets a little bit weaker here because
the 4th book is probably it's the worst book in the series, which is absolutely horrifying considering it is the penultimate series.
Yes. And it's purely because 80% of this book is conflict and action, which, as we say, is one of the author's weakest points. She just doesn't convey force and action scenes as well as they need to be for the action scenes to carry interest in of themselves. And it's a war book that happens in one day.
Right, and for me, it's 80% of the book is the fight, as we've said, and the fighting so rarely feels important or pertinent. You are flashing from one character fighting endless waves of enemies in a destroyed city to the next.
It's all the same action
Why
sequences.
is this fight here in this scene important? It's fight scene, fight scene, fight scene, fight scene, fight scene, fight scene, fight scene. Mm-hmm. And it's like they're not fighting over anything beyond a city, right? Beyond getting to the king and queen. Mm-hmm. It's long and boring and just unappealing. It does. Once again, the author doesn't pull her punches and characters die. And
the problem with that was like one of the main. I didn't find the action as boring, actually, just because They are
intensely boring and intensely repetitive.
very much repetitive, not nuanced, and not distinctive. You don't have minor goals that they all need to achieve to reach the major goal. They're just fighting, and that's this other thing. But the character deaths and characters do die, which on one hand should be commended. On the other hand, all the characters' deaths, you enter the scene, okay, you're dying in this scene. They were intensely, I don't know what the word is, not foreshadowed.
Predictable?
Not even predictable. It's not foreshadowed, that's no, because you saw it happening in the scene, and the author was basically screaming at you, this character, or one of these characters is going to die in this scene.
Mm-hmm. Which is unfortunate, because through screaming about it, one, she took away speed from the progression from the story. She slowed the story down, and then she spoiled the event.
But the deaths were rarely meaningful, and it's not to say that everyone needs to have a heroic sacrifice, or more than often enough there was a bunch of heroic sacrifices, but they rarely achieved something. It was rarely a death that you felt said or meant something to you as a reader.
She did have like one or two that kind of hurt, but there was a lot more that it's like, I kind of see how this is sad.
Mm-hmm. Ebony finally gets more screen time.
Woo woo!
And some really great scenes.
Yeah.
Some really, and less great scenes, more of just some really enjoyable scenes. One involving a dress that I still just think that was a perfect scene for that character.
I'm gonna spoil one of the minor scenes that I really enjoyed, and it's the scene is a splitting of the ways as people go off to complete their various missions, and it's right before the war really gets started, and everybody's staring at these people that have become her family and her closest friends from a life spent of 18 years of complete and utter loneliness. And what struck me is that Ebony has never had to say goodbye in her life. This is the very first time she has actually had to send somebody off into the unknown, and for me it was really enjoyable.
Like the character work and some of the plot work remains excellent in this part of the book. It's all that takes a second to take us backstage to the action that results in the book just being weaker. Yeah. There was one of the characters' endings felt lackluster to me. I'm not going to spoil who, even though it's somewhat not a spoilerish. But
by the way, there are other characters in the story that are not necessarily as standout as Irene and Ebony, but there are other characters that are equally, or I would say not equally, but perfectly grand in their own right that we haven't even mentioned yet. And I don't really intend to, so there. Ha! Mystery. Ooh.
And so the book finally reaches its conclusion, and it is a satisfying and well-deserved conclusion for the various characters.
Mm-hmm.
And that is not to be overlooked.
And like even the villains, because this is where the villains in the final book are also given the ability to shine. And one of the villains, the queen or king, I'm not going to say which, is allowed to actually have a surprising amount of threat, or to exert a surprising amount of threat upon the story that I was not anticipating. And the author built it up a little. It was, once again, just really well handled. And like even the villains are allowed to have decent character and personality and history, and they're not standard cookie cutter, dictator of evil villains.
Yeah. I think I've said pretty much all I wanted to say about the book, the series.
Yeah, the book it was a 4-book series, and it could have done better with a little snipping and cutting and turned into a 3-book series. Probably excised a great deal of the flaws. Because, like I said,
don't know, but maybe.
Because, like I said, remember, one of my main qualms was that repetition, right?
I guess so.
The author repeated various scenes with various character interactions that just slightly character banter was repeated continuously throughout the book, and it was just old and boring at the end. But the series as a whole is like 5.5 stars, and it's just well worth a read.
5.5 stars.
I was going to give it 6, but 6 ran away and got eaten by a
Gave
dragon.
it 55% of a rating, despite how much you enjoyed book 1 and 3. Barely above.
I would have given it a 6, but 6 was eaten by a dragon. So then I wanted to give it a 7, but 7 went off to find itself. 8 was, just lost, and 9...
It was caught in an eternity loop.
Yes, exactly. 9 is just a disreputable number, and 10 is very full of itself. I refuse to interact with that number. So 5.5 out of 5.
I've rated all the books individually, so you can... Actually, no. 3.5 stars for book 4. Obsidian Fragrance.
3 stars for book 4. It was just painful.
That'll be
But
all.
you still have to read the book because it is still many fantastic scenes. It's just they're a little farther away from each other due to the egregious amount of inane battle running around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm done. Au revoir. Goodbye. Attack. Consume. Devour. Microphones.
Goodbye, our future friends. Or fairly well, as I should have said.